We're recording now. How's it going, everybody? So you are here to hear about decoupled blocks, I hope. Before I get started, I kind of wanted to survey the room a little bit. Who here has ever built a fully decoupled Drupal site before? All right, a few of you. Who here has ever built a progressively decoupled Drupal site? And who here has no idea what the difference is? Okay, good. A lot of you. All right, very cool. And what percent of the room, who here is PHP backend primarily kind of people? About half. And who here is more on the JavaScript front end side? Fewer. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to be talking a lot about JavaScript today, but I think a lot of this is in a way that is very relevant to backenders as well. So before we get into everything, my name is Matt Davis. I'm a lead architect at MediaCurrent. Cool place to work. So we're definitely hiring. If you're interested in that, come see me afterwards. And this is the brief agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. Decoupled Blocks is the module for Drupal 8 that we're really going to be getting into the meat of a little bit. But before we get to all that, I'm going to give some of the background and motivation that led to the creation of this module. Starting with weather.com. If any of you were not aware, weather.com is a Drupal site. It launched on Drupal in November of 2014 and has been humming along ever since. A site like weather.com presents some really unique challenges. These are some of the metrics that were brought to us when they were evaluating whether or not to use Drupal. So this is pre-Drupal metrics. And what you can see here, some of the things I would point out is that they had basically no caching strategy at all. They had 144 origin servers because about half of every request that came to weather.com was going all the way to their origin boxes to be built and rendered. So that's obviously a very high traffic site. On a normal day, they'll do about 50 million page views. And then it also is a high variability in traffic site. So when a major weather event occurs, that can spike up to 800 million page views. And aside from lots of traffic, the other big challenge is that they have a lot of very localized kind of data that they want to serve because you want the weather for as close to you as possible. And that kind of presents a lot of caching challenges as well. So yeah, like I mentioned, page views can spike a whole lot. And this was back in October 2012, Superstorm Sandy hit, and they couldn't keep the site up at all, even with their 144 origin boxes. So they knew they had a big problem. So these were some of the problems they brought to us. I'm going to focus less on the caching side, more on how the JavaScript piece of that plays into that, and how that all played into our solution. But some of the other bureaucratic challenges that we had to also accommodate with weather.com is catering to the needs of these different kinds of teams. So they have both large front-end developer teams and large editorial teams that have really distinct needs that we wanted to cater to. So let's talk first about front-end developers. If you're a JavaScript developer, what do you want to do with the Drupal site? Well, fundamentally, you want to learn as little bit about Drupal as you have to. You want to write JavaScript, right? And as much as possible, you want to be able to keep up with JavaScript, which is its own job at this point. JavaScript world is changing really, really quickly, and it's very hard to keep up if you get locked into a specific type of technology and can't pivot and change quickly. Editorial teams for Weather had specific needs going beyond just the ability to create content. They wanted the ability to create whole new pages and layouts and rearrange things and reuse things and really test things out. So more than just creating articles, they wanted to have more control on that. And of course, the overriding concern we had to deal with is how is it all going to perform at scale? So our approach to this problem was to take a long, hard look at what a weather page looks like. This is a forecast page for Holman, Wisconsin, for some reason. And what we saw here, as we started to break this page down into its elements, is that each of these little blocks has kind of different needs in terms of cacheability and personalization. So this is sort of a simplified view. And as I switch back and forth between two forecast locations, what you see is a lot of what's on the page could be served to both. So that's more highly cacheable content. And then there's the little pieces that are very relevant to a specific location that need to change out. So how did we approach this architecturally? Well, we heavily leveraged the panels module, which is a way of placing pieces, panels, panes, kind of like blocks onto pages. And it allowed us to do a lot of cool things with what they call variants, where you can use something called selection rules to choose different versions of a panel page based on contextual information. Its interface is not the greatest, but we found that with a little bit of training, editorial teams were able to really run with building their whole own panels pages and taking these panes that we created. So panels solve some of our problems. Oh, and this is, if you're not familiar with it, this is what the back-end UI of panels looks like. So panels solve some of our problems for the editorial side. But what about, how is that going to cater to front-end developers? We can't have JavaScript developers trying to write CTools plugins to create new panels content types. We didn't want to go down that road. So our solution, and this is where the headless piece really comes in, and the piece that we built. So before I go into our solution, let's talk a little bit about what headless is, or decoupled, same, and what the promise of that is. So there's a lot of hype about going fully headless and the advantages of that, and there are some major advantages. One of the ideas is having a lot of more flexibility in your platform. When you decouple your rendering layer from your data layer, you can upgrade either one independently. So you could have the exact same rendering stack and upgrade from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 without affecting the rendering stack at all, or vice versa. You could redesign your whole site and keep Drupal in the back end exactly the same. So it can allow for a richer user experience, which we'll see. And also what was really important for the weather story was this ability to create once and publish everywhere. So by having a services layer in between, you can create an article, for example, and that article can be consumed by your front-end rendering layer, but also by a mobile app or any other kind of wearable device or whatever's next. So those are some of the reasons people get excited about these kind of headless things. Also, the ability to have total control over your markup in the hands of design and front-end teams can be really valuable as well. But when you go fully headless, there are some problems that you have to re-solve in a way. Things that Drupal already does pretty well that you have to find other solutions for. So that's what these things are about. A big one for us, obviously, with our use of panels was if you go fully headless, you have to re-figure out how are you going to allow regions to be editorially controlled. There's also, depending on how you work it, there can be some performance concerns. If you're making a lot of extra requests back to services layers, that can add to load time. There are ways around that with things like GraphQL where you can consolidate API calls. Also, how do you deal with things like URL aliasing that Drupal handles really well, meta tags that Drupal handles really well. And beyond that, you're reliant on a separate team to impose their own structure, whereas with our setup, we have a single platform that's imposing the structure for all developers to use. So the solution that we built for this, we called the presentation framework. And one of the core ideas here was that we wanted to give this large team of JavaScript developers at Weather the ability to leverage a lot of Drupal's power without having to learn anything about Drupal at all. That was the idea. So how do we accomplish that? At its core, the presentation framework is a way for these JavaScript developers to create panels panes without actually writing a single line of PHP. And they can do that where they can create Angular components or also just static markup, HTML templates, or in some cases we're using TPL FIPS as well. And those components that they are created can either be served directly by Drupal at origin, or also can be served at the edge using a technology called edge side includes, which I'm not going to go a lot into edge side includes today, but I gave a whole session about it at DrupalCon Dublin. So if you're curious, I'd encourage you to look that up. That goes a lot more into the caching and scalability side of that. And at its core, this presentation framework also allows these components to be reusable, versioned, exportable, everything stored in code, so it provides a really clean developer workflow as well. So let's look at what just a single one of these looks like. So this is the file structure you would see for an individual forecast component in this system. And what you'll see here is that everything's compartmentalized. Each component has its own directory, and all of the CSS and JavaScript that it needs to live are right there in the same directory with it. The one piece I'd draw your attention to is down at the bottom here we have this info file. And that info file at the bottom is it's a JSON formatted file with metadata about that component in it. And that is how Drupal recognizes this as a component that it wants to interact with. So the only piece of this that interacts directly with Drupal, as far as these JavaScript developers are concerned, is they have to write this info file with a little bit of metadata. And once they've done that, our presentation framework module crawls all these directories, finding these info files, looks through it, and they've got things like time to live and versioning and all that stuff in them, and turns each of these into a CTools content type, which means that it becomes a panels pane that editorial teams can then place onto pages. So the forecast module you see right here becomes a panel pane that you see in the center here as a CTools content type. So here's the overly complex architectural diagram that I'm not going to go fully into, but the part I would draw your attention to here, and this is where it's the progressively decoupled model, is Drupal is still serving the wrapper of the page, the head, and the layout itself, and also the most heavily cached pieces like the articles that are going to be the same regardless of where you are. That piece is served by Drupal at origin. The content itself is pushed to a services layer, and then at the client side we're actually filling in the most heavily personalized stuff so that we avoid having to cache all of that. So we built all this out. We had a small team of Drupal developers building this for what was actually a larger team of JavaScript developers. And we weren't sure, even as we were building this, like, are these guys really going to buy into this? What's going to happen? Are they really going to want to use it? And it turned out they built over 200 of these components that are all over the site, and that they're constantly building new ones today as well. So all of that is kind of like backstory. That, like I said, that site launched in 2014, so it's been a few years we've been going along with that working really well. So more recently, Weather Underground, which is a sister site to weather.com, was being brought onto this same platform. And one of their first questions is, oh, we see you're still using Angular 1.3. We would really prefer not to use what is already kind of an antiquated thing. Like I said, the JavaScript world is moving really fast, and JavaScript developers like to try to keep up with that and be learning new tools. So they wanted to explore using Angular 2 instead, which at the time was still in alpha state. And I could rant and rave for a long time about the release cycle of Angular 2. But the challenge here was this was a single platform. So we had to go from this presentation framework that was deeply tied and coupled to Angular 1 to make it work with either framework. We were building this in the exact same code base as weather.com. So everything we had to do to make this work with Angular 2 had to not break anything on weather.com as well, hence rebuilding the foundation under the 40-story building. Now, in some ways, once we started exploring this, Angular 2 was actually a much better fit for this system. It takes some of the good ideas from React and is component-based by default. So the kind of compartmentalization we imposed for the Angular 1 version is actually very natural in Angular 2. It also caters directly to component load on demand, which our lazy loading solution for the Angular 1 piece took a whole lot of work and effort. With Angular 2, we pretty much were just handed that for free. In other ways, it was not so good of a fit, and we had to wrangle some things. So two of the things we wanted to do, as I showed you, Drupal's still serving the wrapper of these pages, and then we have different distinct pieces that would be Angular 2 components. Well, Angular 2 wants to have a full page, basically. They want to wrap around everything, and every component by default is supposed to have its own template. So we had to work directly with the Angular team, actually, to explore what was then an internal API called long-form bootstrap, which allows you to bootstrap specific distinct components into a wrapper that you still control, and they're all part of the same app. Another challenge was we wanted the ability to reuse components, which meant on the Drupal side we wanted to be able to generate, when you were placing one of these panels panes, we're going to generate a unique ID for that panel pane. And that means the element itself, how do we bootstrap onto an element that we don't know the name of in advance? So we had to figure that part out as well. There was no way to dynamically hook into an element whose name you didn't know in advance. And again, we worked really closely with the Angular team to make all of that possible as well. So, where are we headed with all of this? Well, like I said, we built this single platform that allowed us now to be using multiple kinds of JavaScript frameworks with it. And really, as soon as we started exploring opening the door to Angular 2, we realized the amount of refactoring we've done here now, we're not beholden to either Angular 1 or Angular 2. We've really built a tool that is JavaScript framework-agnostic. And that means now we could build a React submodule and have React components start being built, or Ember, or Vue.js, or whatever the next framework is that we haven't even heard about yet. So that was a really exciting piece of this. Now, this whole project was built on Drupal 7. So none of this existed in Drupal 8 until early this year when I started building Decoupled Blocks. So Decoupled Blocks, our old model was all built around very directly tied to the panels module, but in Drupal 8, blocks aren't terrible anymore. They are reusable, they are versionable, they are exportable into code. So you get a lot of the things that were problematic with blocks are no longer issues anymore. And furthermore, panels in Drupal 8 is built on top of blocks. So anything that is a block can also be a panel pane. They're the same thing, which means a decoupled block you can drop into a page using the core blocks placement UI or the panels UI. It works either way, or some other block placement UI that could come along later on. And we get a lot of other gains with the Drupal 8 version. The plugin API is a vast improvement. We have a lot more RESTful support in core now, and there's the API first initiative in core as well, where a lot more is pushing new ways for us to interact with Drupal's data layer from the front end. And then there's also the GraphQL piece, which has been getting a lot of hype. I'm not going to talk too much about GraphQL, but it's super cool. It's a way for the front end components to actually define the exact structure of data that they want to receive when calling making an API call. So instead of having to have 100 different API endpoints with slightly different versions of data or whatever, you can have a single API endpoint and let the front end just say, hey, I want the title and the ID of a node, and it returns it in the exact format that you've asked for. So under the hood, some of the things that changed when we moved into this Drupal 8 version of all of this. Well, the JSON info file that I showed you, now we're using YAML, which is the Drupal 8 standard. One of the cool things about that is we're actually leveraging the core extension discovery. So the same discovery mechanism that looks in Drupal 8 sites for modules and profiles and themes, we're using that exact same stuff to find our decoupled components as well. And we're using something called block derivatives to take a single block definition and let us make lots of blocks on the fly. So in a similar way to how we were finding these components back with the presentation framework in Drupal 7, we find these components and turn them in. We just multiply from a single block definition, so each one is its own block that you can place on the pages. Now, because I've been working a lot on Angular 2 for the last year, the part of decoupled blocks that has gotten the most traction at this point is the Angular 2 submodule. Like I said, this was built from the ground up to be JavaScript framework agnostic, but right now the Angular 2 piece is the most fleshed out. There are some React. There's a React submodule and a little basic stuff there. There's been some work on an Ember submodule as well. But really, I'm looking for help from people who would like to use this with other frameworks to help build those pieces out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the success we've had with the Angular 2 piece right now. I'll demo here in a minute the version that's still built back on RC3. I actually have a working branch that's Angular 2 was just released I think about a month ago now. So I have a branch that's working with Angular 2, but it hasn't been merged in yet. We have full lazy loading out the box with the Angular 2 piece, and actually it looks for components whether they're in the viewport or not, and will only load all of the component assets when they're found to be in the viewport. We have functionality that allows you to have globally injected services. So there's two types of services you can use in Angular 2. You can have component-specific services, where it's a single instance for each component, or you can have singletons, where it's a shared service across components so they can store state and communicate among each other. And we have it set up so that you can globally share singleton services without actually having to edit the wrapper app at all. You can do it all from within your own component. And we have TypeScript compilation support in there, and we're using Gulp to allow you to just watch TypeScript files and compile on the fly as you're making changes. Oh, and as I kind of already mentioned, there's work on other framework support that's ongoing, but I can definitely use help with that part. And if you have a framework you're excited to see work with decoupled blocks, definitely come talk to me afterwards. So, when would you consider using a tool like decoupled blocks? Now, obviously from the kind of background I gave, this came out of the enterprise level, came out of very specific needs for a high-performant, high-scalability site. And in a lot of ways, it was built kind of with that in mind. But one of the things I realized as I was building this out is that there's actually a pretty strong use case, I think, for using this on smaller projects as well. Part of the whole idea here is you allow people to write their JavaScript in isolation from Drupal without having to know Drupal. So if you're a small mom and pop shop, is it easier to find a Drupal JavaScript expert, or who can write great JavaScript code and turn that into a Drupal module? Or is it easier to find just a JavaScript expert? Well, that's going to be a lot easier for you, right? And so with just a little YAML file, you can take someone else's JavaScript work and turn that into a block that Drupal's aware of without having to write any PHP at all. And it also opens the ability to just, hey, I've built this whole Drupal site and I want to do something cool that you can't really do in PHP. I want to have this rich widget of whatever, and I found an open source version of that. Someone's already written this thing in Angular 2 or React or whatever. It's out there on GitHub. I can just add a YAML file that declares that to Drupal and put that into my Drupal project. So those are some of those kind of smaller scale use cases that I would see. So let's now switch over and have a look at some of this. I guess I'll show some code first. I don't know if you guys can see that at all. So the main PDB module, PDB is progressively decoupled blocks. Very wordy, I know. The main PDB module is actually, there's not a whole lot going on in it. It really does two primary things. It defines the mechanism for finding these components, for crawling your site directories and figuring out where these components are, which, like I said, is all based on the core extension discovery. And then it takes the metadata from those YAML files and turns them into blocks. That's really all that's going on with the core piece of this module. Now, where there's flexibility there is it allows each submodule for each JavaScript framework to say, okay, if I'm an Angular 2 block, I need a specific kind of element markup to inject my component onto, which may look different to how React is going to do it with JSX, for example. So each submodule in here can define its own block, what will actually be rendered by Drupal for that block that it injects its JavaScript onto. So in the Angular 2 submodule here, we have a bunch of example components that you can play with. I'll show you what one of these looks like here in a minute. And then we have a lot of the core stuff that's driving this. We have the wrapper app itself, our configuration for TypeScript and System.js. And then we have these classes that are providing the functionality of in-viewport lazy loading and the global injection of services. But let's have a look at what one of these example components actually looks like. I think we'll start with just a super simple one. So here you see we've only got 3 files in here. This is about as simple as an Angular 2 component can get. We have our actual component definition. This is a TypeScript file, which I'll show you how we compile this down into JavaScript in a minute. We have the template for this, which is just basically a hello world. And then we have this YAML file, which says, hey Drupal, hey Decoupled Blocks, turn me into a block. All right. And let's see how that works on your Drupal site. So, as you see here, I've turned on the Decoupled Blocks module and the Angular 2 and React submodules. Once you do that, for the Angular 2 piece, you also have a package.json, so you have to run npm install as well. And once you've done that, you come into your block layout and go to place a block, and what you'll see here is, oh hey, we have some Angular 2 PDB blocks ready to go. And we also have a React block that's just a hello world in this branch. So let's drop one on here. We'll move it up to the top here so we can see it a little better. And go back to our site. And hey, what do you know? That's an Angular 2 component right there. And there's stuff already in here because it's actually storing these to-do list in local storage. I've already done that. I'm right in the middle of that. All right, so we've only got one left here. And in the exact same way, I'm gonna go ahead and do something you should never do, which is put a React block on the same page as an Angular 2 block. There's a core bug with this block placement thing. Let's put down the sidebar. So yeah, the React one's super simple. It's just a hello world. But that is, over here we have a block being rendered by React, and over here we have one being rendered by Angular 2. Oh, and let me show you some of the compilation stuff. Right now for Angular 2, we have a super simple configuration single checkbox, which is development mode on or off. That's all there is right now. I'll show you in the inspection here in the console. We're actually loading these TypeScript files, and we're running in development mode right now. You wouldn't want to be loading TypeScript files on a production box, because that means you're actually doing all that compiling in the browser at runtime. That's not performant. We don't want to do that. We want to do that ahead of time. So over here, I have a gulp task that is gulp compile. It's going to throw some typing errors because I haven't put all my types in here. But what that just did, I just typed gulp compile, and it went through the entire Angular 2 components and found all those TypeScript files and compiled them into JavaScript. Oh, that you can't see at all. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, it took those TypeScript files and turned them into JavaScript. And then we can come back over here to turn off development mode, clear our caches, and now the same block is now being rendered, but we're not in development mode anymore. That's rendering actual straight up JavaScript files.
Where does it put the compiled JavaScript?
By default, it's putting them right next to the TypeScript components, so it's in that same directory. And right now, that's not configurable, but we could actually make that a configurable option where you want them to land pretty easily. Yeah, good question. And I think that's about it for my live demo. Let's talk a little bit, though, about some of the hard problems we have left to solve. I mean, we have a pretty amazing vision for what could be possible with decoupled blocks, but there are definitely some hard problems left. One of the big ones is dependency management. If you want the ability to go on GitHub and grab different Angular 2 components made by different people and drop them onto a single page, they may have different dependencies on different versions of Angular 2. How do we deal with that kind of thing? There's an NPM package called npm deps that we've been looking into a little bit. I haven't quite figured out how to make it work. But what it claims to do is it will go through nested directories, find all the package.jsons, and compile those into one that will respect the dependencies of everything underneath it, or tell you exactly when things aren't going to be compatible with each other. Because in NPM, you can say, I need at least this version of something, or you can shrink wrap and say, I need this specific version. So there will be cases where things just aren't going to be cross-compatible with each other. But we need to have smart warning systems in place to say, hey, you're about to try to place a block that's not going to work with your other block on the page. Bundling is another big question. We have to figure out where that line is between what's Drupal going to aggregate and what are we going to rely on JavaScript build steps to do bundling as well. And a lot of this comes back to how opinionated we want to be versus allowing flexibility. The Angular 2 submodule, for example, is all built using System.js, but there's also a lot of hype around using Webpack with Angular 2 instead. And by default, you can't really mix and match those easily. So we've made an opinion that System.js is where we're at right now, but we want to find the lines of where can we offer enough flexibility to JavaScript developers that they can use their preferred tools while still allowing you to basically turn on the module and have stuff work. And so if people have ideas about any of these harder problems, I'd definitely be interested in hearing them. Also, we're looking at how, as we build out multiple frameworks implementations here, how we can find common problems that are shared across them and try to solve those at a higher level, rather than Angular 2 having one way to bundle and React having a different way to bundle, and all those being in the separate framework modules. And that's all I've got. Thank you. Yes, questions?
Yeah, so I'm a user of weather.com and Underground, and noticed that now that's progressively decoupled blocks, like the loading and the user experience is kind of like a little bit wonky from a consumer's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what kind of things have you heard from your end about moving toward the whole model of progressively decoupled blocks? Like, what are the cons of doing that, especially on a site like weather.com and Underground?
What are the cons of going progressively as opposed to just having Drupal serve everything?
Yeah.
I mean, there is an element of when you're lazy loading things in, the end user is seeing stuff being pulled in, right? So that can create a user experience that not everyone thinks is pleasant, which may be what you're talking about. Some of that, from our perspective, is pretty necessary. in terms of serving people hyper-localized data without having our origin boxes fall over. So some of that was a necessary strategy for how do we make Drupal scale to the kind of demands that this site is under. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There are some drawbacks there, and it's an ongoing struggle to try to cater to as many of those people as we can. Yeah. There's also been a big push since IBM acquired the weather company earlier this year to move from just being more US focused to being more globally focused. And so that means we need to be able to cater to low bandwidth 2G phone users in developing countries and things like that. So we're trying to find ways to do that as well, which a whole bunch of JavaScript on a page can't really solve that problem. Yeah.
So is the module right now doing two-way data mining, or is it just consuming like
the Angular 2 module, yeah, you can absolutely do two-way data binding. Mm-hmm. There's an example component in the module that will show you how to do that. Yeah.
So it seems like this is a really good solution for a problem that you had with your clients, and it's working out. In the kind of emerging Drupal 8 module ecosystem, are there other people working on similar things that you're sort of looking at or maybe competing with for mind share and getting developers on board with your solution?
I wouldn't say there's competing technologies. I think there's a lot of people trying to solve slightly different problems in the decoupling space, which to me is a really exciting thing. Like I said, there's the core initiative to be very API first, which I think is exciting. One of the things I didn't talk about in this talk is how we consume Drupal data in those components. And there's a few different ways you can do that. You can do that through a traditional RESTful endpoint. You can do that with the GraphQL module. And there's actually ways to have Drupal settings have already in it configuration and information that you need in your components as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff happening in scalability with refreshless and big pipe, and I think a lot of these things can play well together. Yeah.
So just in terms of making modular choices, as we're looking at building out the sites, and it's a long-term plan, and that's where the question comes from.
Yeah, no, I totally understand, and I think this is just one more tool in your toolbox, you know. So it really comes down to your specific use case, whether this is the right tool for you. And I mentioned some of those use cases. I think giving JavaScript developers the ability to create things in isolation and still catering to editorial teams that want to have control over where those end up, that's kind of one of the key features that we're catering towards.
do the components have to go into a Drupal module, or could they go in the theme as well?
They can go pretty much everywhere, because like I said, it's using the same extension discovery that Core uses. So anywhere that you might have a module or a theme or a profile, it will look for these components. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.